Okay, I think we're safe. All right. Hello, my name is Joey Hensler, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending this afternoon's program. The Dole Institute Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the work of the Dole Institute. We attend regular meetings, assist in events just like this one, and plan an SAB-sponsored program every semester. Members of the SAB receive great opportunities to network with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. The DIOP would like to hear from you. If you enjoyed this afternoon's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. Your attendance and feedback help shape future programming. To view our past programs, visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org. A video of this afternoon's presentation will be available on our website soon. Before we begin today, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the presentation, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I will come with a microphone. If I don't have a microphone near you, we cannot pick up your voice on our audio, which means the people listening on the web will not be able to hear you. So please wait for the microphone. And ask just one brief question. Finally, if at any time during the program you have trouble hearing, ask a staff member or a student volunteer who will assist you. So now, please welcome Dr. Jim Wilbanks, the Director of the Military History Department at the Army Command and General Staff College.
Thank you, Joey. I'd like to welcome you to the 10th and final presentation on this series on decisive battles. And today we have Dr. Gregory Hospodor. Greg is a graduate of William and Mary, as well as Ole Miss and LSU. I graduated from Texas A&M, but I hired him anyway. And we haven't looked back since hiring him. I first met him at West Point. He's a valued member of the department, even though he is somewhat school challenged in terms of his alumni affiliation. So without further ado, Greg.
Well, the first thing I want to do is welcome you all here today, especially those folks who are here from the Command and General Staff College. So I like to say before these talks, they've come here to hear about something they already know, and I really appreciate the fact that they've turned out. I will tell you I have a cold today, so if the talk's bad, please understand I'm blaming it on Dayquil, all right? And if it's good, it's all about me, all right? Nevertheless, well, what we're going to talk about today is the Battle of Buena Vista, and more generally grounding it in terms of the war with Mexico. So there's the agenda. We have to talk a little bit about why the battle occurred, why the war began, what the strategy was, and the opposing forces. And then we'll march on to the road to get us to Buena Vista. The Northern Campaign, commanded by General Zachary Taylor, at First Brigadier General, then Major General Zachary Taylor. There's a shift in strategy, then the plans that bring us to the battlefield. We'll talk a bit about the battle itself, and then I want to reflect on the assess Taylor's leadership, the battle, and then really talk about the legacy of the fight, and then maybe longer term, talk to you a little bit about the legacy of this war with Mexico. If Buena Vista is an unknown decisive battle, generally for most Americans, I find that the Mexican War in general is an unknown war. So we need to talk a bit about that. Why war with Mexico? That's not the theme of the talk, but there are a lot of reasons for the war with Mexico. I know all of you can read. One is, of course, manifest destiny. And in the broadest sense, it's the feeling that the United States, as they said in the 1840s, was a go-ahead country, and that expansion and spreading Americanness, especially to the west coast of North America, was something that we were predestined to do. Another cause was that there were troubles south of the border. Other than Mexico's first president, between her first president and the 1840s, Mexican presidents serve on average about 18 months. They have a 6-year term. So there's a lot of instability. What we might call that today is it's a challenge state, and maybe even a failed state. There are American citizens living in Mexico. Many of them are in a place called Texas. They have nominally become Mexican citizens. Nevertheless, they have strong ties back to the United States. They have been mistreated by the Mexican government, often for doing things like trying to start revolutions. Okay? And we're a bit concerned about that, at least north of the border. Mexico owes a lot of money. Many are damage claims. They also owe debts to the United States and United States creditors. Perennially, states in Latin America will borrow money, and then that borrowing of money gives the United States and really other European powers the excuse and the opportunity to intervene. There's a dispute between Mexico and the U.S. over the boundaries of Texas. Once Texas is annexed, that contributes to some of the tension. The primary reason, though, I've got two primary reasons underlined below. In 1844, the Democratic Party, who will elect James K. Polk as president, runs on a program of expansion. Mexico and Mexico's territory in California is the primary one of it. Texas and Oregon, the settlement of the Oregon dispute, where the boundary between what is today Canada and the United States is another one. And then there remains the question of what's going on in Mexico. And what's interesting there is most high-level Mexican politicians, whichever side of political argument they were on, appreciated the fact that any conflict with the United States was probably not going to turn out well for them. And yet they rushed headlong into war. And the real reason for that is that no one could willingly give away a portion of their country and survive politically in what's already an unstable environment. And so you're left with this kind of conundrum of Mexico realizing this probably isn't going to go well, and yet, fighting a war against the United States. They almost knew they were going to lose, but had to fight. And so we end up then with a conflict with Mexico. If we're going to talk a bit about territorial expansion, this is the state of the United States in 1840. There is a republic in Texas. It's gained its independence in 1836, and today we like to say, as I think most Texans do, that it is like a whole other country. Am I right, boss? Okay. Between 1836 and 1845, it was a whole other country. But it's sitting there. The question of annexation, which arose immediately after Texas declared its independence, is a thorny one in the United States, primarily because of the issue of slavery. But it has come up again. And it'll be through joint resolution of Congress that annexation will be proposed, offered, and that Texas will accept it. Nevertheless, we've got our eyes out here on the jewel, which is San Francisco. And that really is one of the goals. Various proposals are entertained for how to gain San Francisco. There are very few Mexicans living out in the Californias. If you count Baja California and what's called Alta California up in present-day California today, there are only about 33,000 Mexican citizens living in that area. So it's not very populated. But the view is that whoever controls San Francisco and then further south towards San Diego and Los Angeles is going to control the west coast of the United States, what will become the United States. And we're vastly concerned that the British have their eyes on it. And if Britain gets in there, it might hinder the natural growth of the United States further west. We get eventually Nevada, Utah, and elsewhere, New Mexico, kind of as a sidelight because they connected along. Expansion is the program. I want to say this, that the conflict with Mexico is not the only one that we have going on, and President James K. Polk is absolutely more than willing to rattle his saber in order to get what he thinks he wants. There is a dispute with Great Britain over what was the joint occupation of the Oregon Territory. And 5440, or fight, some of you may remember from high school history classes, is one of the mottos that's put out by the Democrats in particular. We're not actually desirous of fighting, but we, as a negotiating position, we wanted the British to believe that we were willing to do so. In the end, we draw a compromise line, and the only mistake I can see here is that we just didn't go a little further and get Vancouver, because Vancouver's kind of a cool place. Nevertheless, there's a line drawn. We stopped joint occupation, which opens up. On the ground, Americans were already moving via the Oregon Trail into the Oregon Territory, and The drawing of that line in 1846 will simply affirm what's already becoming the fact on the ground. More Americans are moving west. Okay? President Polk signed the bill granting Texas statehood in December 1845, and Texas will affirm that in early 1846. So two of the big parts of the Democratic program are taken care of, and that leaves us with Mexico. Polk will send this fella here, John Slidell. He's not a Louisianian by birth, but he becomes a Louisianian, and he is sent down with one of the coolest names. If you can ever put this on your vita or resume, I highly recommend you get the job. Envoy Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary. And he's sent to Mexico in order to negotiate to gain California. He is advised to settle the Texas border dispute, and we'll look at the disputed area here in a little while. And he's also authorized to offer $25 million to acquire California. Now, what happens is the Mexicans can't meet with him. They know he's there. It becomes a political hot potato. Slidell sits there unrecognized officially by the Mexican government. James K. Polk will receive word on January 12, 1846, that Slidell is going to be rejected. In other words, they're never going to receive him officially to negotiate. And the next day, we've marched an army after the annexation of Texas, or at least like it looks like it's going to move forward. We march an army down to the Nueces River at a place called Corpus Christi. We have an American army there, still within what is, everybody affirms, is part of Texas proper, not in what will be called the disputed territory. On the next day, once he realizes diplomacy isn't going to work, that army is ordered south to the Rio Grande, near what is today present-day Brownsville, Texas, which kind of leads us getting into the conflict. All right, let's talk briefly about strategy. Now, once the decision is made to use military force in order to win this war, all right, to win California, there is a plan in place. One of them is to send a small force across country. The Army of the West under Kearny moves out here, very thinly populated. There are a few fights out in California. California, pretty much with the Bear Flag Revolt, among other things, there are Americans already living there, falls pretty quickly. So we've gotten very quickly what it is the goal of the Polk administration for the war. And you'll also notice from Fort Leavenworth, there was a famous march by James Doniphan into northern Mexico. John Wool, another American general, will march into northern Mexico as well. And the main American army is over here on the Rio Grande, where the first two fights of the war will take place in May 1846. The Polk administration's strategy essentially is this. Let's go in, let's seize what we want, let's whack the Mexican army, let's seize a portion of northern Mexico, and then what will they do? Hopefully come to the table, because what we want is a negotiated settlement. It is exactly the thing the Mexicans don't do. And we'll be left later on, after several victories, with a victorious but small American army in northern Mexico. And then the question is, we've got a war, how do we bring it successfully to a conclusion? Okay? So generally, initially, the strategy is for the main forces, which will end up, Buena Vista takes place in northern Mexico near Monterrey, is to seize northern Mexico in hopes of gaining a negotiated settlement. So we go to war with an olive branch in one hand and a stick in the other. And the hope is we'll use the stick and then go, hey, you want to talk? And we're hoping that's going to work. The problem you have is Mexico has several million people. It is a huge landmass. We have a small army. What's going to happen if they don't come to the table? Now, you don't need to read every single one of these. This is the main character in our story. It's a guy named Zachary Taylor. He will command the northern campaign, and he will be the commander at Buena Vista. Before that, he wins a string of battles in northern Mexico. Taylor is apolitical up to this point. He'll turn out to be a Whig. There are two political parties at the time, the Whig and the Democratic Party. Taylor has never voted in a presidential election before his own, which will take place after the conflict. He is the most palatable of all the generals in the U.S. Army at the time. President Polk does not want to put him in charge in northern Mexico, but he likes him a heck of a lot better than another general that's there in Washington, a guy named Winfield Scott, who clearly had presidential aspirations and would run against the Democratic candidate in the next election. So Taylor gets command of this army to march in. He's given the orders to, the olive branch in one hand, a stick in another. He'll fight initially 2 fights right along the, just north of the Rio Grande near present-day Brownsville, Texas, at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma in May 1846. And then he will build up the size of his army. He will build up supplies, and he'll march south to Monterrey. And in September 1846, we will take Monterrey in northern Mexico. And the question then is going to be what to do next. We'll look at it. The point I want to make about Zachary Taylor is this. Zachary Taylor is not a West Pointer. All right? He's been in the Army since 1808. He is a product, he is a regular through and through. He's a nationalist. He'll prove that when he becomes president, when he goes against Southern political interests. But he is a product of the United States Army and its officer development such as it is. And the reason I point that out is often the interpretation of Taylor's conduct in northern Mexico and at Buena Vista is often kind of pushed to the backlight because Winfield Scott becomes the example of what a professional soldier is. And I would argue that at the time, they were both considered professionals. And we'll talk maybe a little bit more later about why it is that Taylor's reputation, he's often said that he was lucky or that he was brave but dumb. The U.S. Army at the time, it's tiny. This is what we're going to go to war with a nation of several million people with. We're authorized, the U.S. Army, the regulars, are authorized 8,613. There are roughly 5,500 regulars in the U.S. Army in 1846. Taylor will have most of them with him in northern Mexico. So if he had lost either one of the first 3 battles, he pretty much would have lost the entire United States Army as it existed at the time. So he assumes a lot of risk there. We're not going to be able to fight this war with regulars alone, although there will be 11 regiments added to the U.S. Army during the conflict. 73,000 volunteers will be raised. And essentially, National Guard units will be raised to serve in Mexico as well, although many of them won't get any further south than their home state. One of the keys here is that the U.S. Officer Corps is professionalizing, so there are a lot of West Point graduates, and I'd be remiss if I didn't point out there's another military academy, Norwich, which turns out several hundred professional officers as well. That's going to be the leadership, and it's going to be leadership that'll be one of the things that will account for the reason why the United States Army in combat with Mexico is so successful. The Mexican Army has 18,000 regulars in 20 regiments. They have a National Guard on active service of about 10,000. During the war itself, there'll be 70 light units, guerrilla units that are raised, and they'll give out special dispensations to people to raise these types of units. The issue with the Mexican Army is that primarily what the Mexican Army had done at home was it was for political stability. It was used as a political instrument. It's not really designed for major combat operations. Now, the U.S. Army isn't as well, but Zachary Taylor will take the opportunity to train that army to meet another army in the field when he's at Corpus Christi. Many of the Mexican soldiers are not volunteers. They're dragooned into the army. Although they're brave, their leadership are primarily looked at. It's riven by political strife. The leadership of the Mexican army, Santa Anna being a fellow who served as president, I think 6 times, is an example of what we're talking about. He's a general, and he also plays politics on the side. So although on paper the Mexican army looks powerful, in reality it isn't. We'll just talk briefly about the northern campaign, and the battles are sequential. The first 2 battles take place north of the Rio Grande. There's the fight in September 1846. We haven't gotten what we wanted. Mexico's not negotiating. What do we do? And that will end up leading to a shift in strategy and eventually lead to a fight here at Buena Vista, which is a little further south and west of Monterrey. Now, after Monterrey, this is the plan that Zachary Taylor had in northern Mexico. What he wanted to do was establish essentially a line along the Sierra Madre to block off any Mexican march from Tampico north or from San Luis Potosí north as well. It's about 250 miles here with an outpost line in front of it. We had about a 250-mile long logistics line that ran all the way back to the mouth of the Rio Grande as well. That's Taylor's plan after Monterrey. Now the problem is you could sit there for years if Mexico never came to the table. And so that will lead roughly to a shift in strategy, which we'll talk about in just a second. Now, to point out the size of the American forces relative to the problem that we're talking about, in Zachary Taylor's area of responsibility, there are about 276,000 Mexican citizens. We have below 15,000 troops. The ratio there is 18-1. That's aside from any Mexican army we may meet in the field. So this is a vast area. The folks are spread out, and there are a vast number of civilians in that area. Now, the only way that this small American force could actually kind of hold an area that size is simply because Mexico herself was not united as terms of nationalism. In other words, those political strife at home divided them. Now, what could change that? And I'll plant this seed with you now. A major victory against the Americans could change everything. As long as the Americans seem to be victorious, those folks aren't coming out of the woodwork. All right? There's a shift in strategy. We haven't gotten what we want after Monterrey. And this involves all these characters. We've facilitated the return of this fellow here, who is Santa Anna, to return to Mexico. He'll be elected president. He says he's going to negotiate with us. He's going to look out for our own interest. Instead, what he does is raise an army and fight against us. That's what Santa Anna did. Any Mexican could have told him that. He had been exiled from the country for his political machinations. Polk will facilitate his return. Now he's going to fight against us. Zachary Taylor's in northern Mexico. He's won 3 battles. He's also now made it clear that he's a Whig and he's a potential presidential candidate. So Polk has an issue as a Democrat. If I let Zachary Taylor win any more fights, I've just made a president from that party over there. So there's a guy that Polk doesn't like in the least, this fellow here named Winfield Scott, who is a brilliant general, but he's also a guy that probably would irritate the heck out of everybody in the room if we had to work with him. He says, okay, I'm going to put Scott in charge, and what we're going to do now is try to impose our will on the Mexicans by marching towards their capital. And we're going to shift from northern Mexico. The focus is going to be on Veracruz, following the route of Cortez to Mexico City in hopes that that will cause the Mexicans to come to the table. Okay? So what's going to happen is Taylor's left up here to hang on the vine and not gain any more laurels, and then Scott can march in from here. By the way, Polk had also proposed that they create a new high-level general position and offer it to Thomas Hart Benton. All right? So a Democrat. Now, that didn't go anywhere, but the idea being this is clearly politics are involved with who gets to be a general. All right, the road to Buena Vista. These were the orders that Taylor had received. What he's supposed to do now is all the regulars are going to move over, or almost all the regulars are going to move over and join Winfield Scott's main expedition, which is going to march towards Mexico City. So with primarily National Guard, that is state troops, Taylor is going to hold northern Mexico, and he is ordered to return to Monterrey. He had advanced out and established this line out here. You're supposed to go back to Monterrey. He has his orders, and he ignores them. Now, he's angry. He's playing politics himself. He doesn't like the fact that he has been ordered to go back to Monterrey and essentially sit on his hands and play policeman in northern Mexico. What's supposed to happen is his regulars are supposed to march down, take Tampico, get on boats, sail down to Veracruz, join up with the rest of Scott's forces, and march overland to Mexico City. In reality, this is what happens. Taylor pushes forward. He doesn't hold that entire line, so the regulars march down here to Tampico. He doesn't expect that Santa Anna will move north against him. So what he does is he moves as far forward as he feels like he can safely. He only has about 5,000 men in his army. He moves forward to a place called Saltillo, which is near where Buena Vista will take place. And Santa Anna, who is politically kind of unstable at home, he begins to collect troops at San Luis Potosí, down here. He collects about 20,000 men. He withdraws the garrison to Tampico, which leaves it open to American occupation. He assumes a lot of risk, but now he's gathered these troops together. Politically, he has to do something with him. He has intercepted a message that lets him know what the Americans' plans are, and he says, I'm going to march across 250 miles of desert. I'm going to strike this small American army. I'm going to win a decisive victory that will affirm for me, politically at home, that yes, I'm the caudillo, the strong man that you should follow, and it might also ignite the flames of Mexican nationalism. And if that happens, with only about 30,000 American troops in Mexico against over 10 million Mexicans, this will not turn out well for the United States. There's a chance of winning this war. He is banking on military victory to establish himself politically. So his plan then is, and he leaves on January 28th, and he marches across the desert towards Taylor's army at Saltillo. Okay. As he gets closer to, well, first of all, I'll tell you this. The march from San Luis Potosí north is, well, let's just say this. Logistics are not the forte of the Mexican army. Okay? He establishes some logistics base ahead, but he will end up losing, out of the 20,000 that march, about 5,000 troops will wither away. Some are sick, some just leave. They're not being sustained properly. The march itself takes about 3 weeks to move north. So he gets there, he gets within striking distance of Taylor's forces here around Saltillo with about 15,000 men. The Mexican soldiers who will do battle with the Americans on February 22nd and February 23rd have not. The infantrymen haven't eaten in 2 days. They're at the tail end. This is really, it is as if he's bet everything he has, he's lost it, and somebody said double or nothing. And what he does is he says, okay, I'm all in. Because if this doesn't go well for Santa Anna, and he doesn't beat the Americans in this fight, what's going to happen is that Mexican army, as it turns out, has to turn around and march back to San Luis Potosí. And he's going to lose again. If he lost a lot marching north, he's going to lose a lot more marching south. But he's pushed all in. So he's looking to give decisive battle. Taylor has largely discounted the fact that Santa Anna's army is moving north. There's been some reconnoitering in the area around Saltillo, which is his main logistics base, and Monterrey's back here where he's supposed to be. Now, Taylor will say, there's a reason why I forward defended here. And he actually brings up the political point that if the Mexicans beat us, if we surrender this area, then that will only encourage these folks to think that we're not strong. And if they think we're not strong, then they're going to come out of the woodwork. If you think they're guerrillas here now, hitting our logistics lines, wait till we pull back and we show some weakness. That's his justification. The other is this. This 250 miles is largely desert. The first place you can replenish an army is right here. And he also says, that's why I stayed there. Because any army that marches north is going to be at the end of its tether. And to surrender a place where the Mexican army could march north, replenish, and then move on Monterrey is only to guarantee that we're going to be in a tough spot when they come. And by the way, I took Monterrey. And although it looks good, there are fortifications around it, it's really open to assault. This is a better defensive position. So that's the reason why Taylor's going to be forward. That being said, when they do show up, the Mexicans, and word comes to them that word comes to the Americans that the Mexicans have moved north, Taylor's going to be mildly surprised. Now, there's another regular with him, a guy named John Wool, who was stationed in this area, and he reconnoitered the best position to do a defense. And that was at a place called Buena Vista. The Mexicans call it Angostura, which is the Narrows. And it's a pass through the mountains along the main road. So they've got a reconnoitered position if the Mexicans show up where they think they can hold with a small force. Now I want to point this out. Taylor's army has about 5,000 men. Really about 4,700 will be engaged in the battle. There are less than 500 of these are regulars. Almost all those regulars are either in the cavalry or the largest contingent are in the artillery. All right? Taylor's well provisioned. Santa Anna has approximately 15,000 men. A quarter of them are cavalry, but they're ill provisioned. They're at the end of their tether. They have to attack. Santa Anna's plan is to march north with his main army along the main road to send a cavalry unit via kind of an ill-used pass to hit Saltillo in the American rear if they defend forward, and then he sent out a call for guerrilla bands to strike upon the Americans. And the idea is he'll brush the Americans aside quickly, because after all, they're almost all volunteers. They will break, they will run, and then everyone will get, kill their own American, and they'll put his skin up on the wall or something like that. At least that's the idea, okay? There's nothing wrong with this plan, right? He gets what he wants. He's massed 3-to-1 combat power against the American army. The only thing he didn't get to choose was the location that he was going to end up fighting at. Now, this is the battlefield at Buena Vista, and if it looks hazy, that's good, because I want it to be to a certain extent, okay? There are mountains on either side. These are the narrows, okay? One thing I think you can appreciate is the Sierra Madre, huge mountains on either side. There's low ground right here. It's broken up. This would be, in military terms, what we call highly restrictive terrain. There are also a series of drainage ravines that come down off the mountainside as well. This is the position that the Americans are going to defend. This is a photograph here taken from roughly this area, looking down one of the spines down towards this restrictive terrain. And Santa Anna comes up with a plan to remove the Americans from the main road and to break their army. And if you look at this map, the plan he comes up with actually makes good military sense. First, I'll set the American defense. The one place we can't lose is here along the main road, because if the main road breaks, they've got an easy, straight avenue into the rear, okay? We set up guns here. There's high ground. We set up heavy guns down here and entrench some infantry right here along the main road. That's not the place Santa Anna wanted to take anyway. What he figures is the key is to get my large army up onto this flat ground, right? The tops of these spines going down towards the water course. So really what he's going to do is try to get his army up here, knock the Americans off, and then do a big turning movement around this American defensive position at the narrowest, most restrictive part, okay? And for the Americans, with a much smaller force, the goal is going to be to not allow Santa Anna's army to deploy. So most of the fighting is going to take place right in this area right here, okay? The Mexicans moving up and then coming down in this direction. The Americans fighting to not allow them to deploy and get their mass onto our smaller forces. This is a good depiction of kind of it's a dramatized depiction, but you can get an impression. This is the low ground, highly restrictive. This is the way the plateau looks, and it's cut by ravines. The Mexican army is working to move in this direction, and Americans then are ending up either trying to prevent them from getting up onto this, or when they're not, holding these ridges that don't allow them to come down onto the main road. So in essence, that's what's going to happen over a 2-day fight. All right? The first day, on the 22nd, George Washington's birthday, the Mexican army is going to work with dismounted American cavalry. They'll push troops up into the mountains, trying to break off the flank guard of the American forces that are kind of holding a line roughly like that. All right? And that's relatively indecisive. The big fight, the most famous part of the fight, happens on the 23rd. All right? The second day. And again, this is that same map, except this is the direction of Buena Vista. Saltillo's back here in the background. The Mexican forces, the mass of their forces are deployed here, and there'll be a series of engagements along these ravines and then up onto the plain where smaller, outnumbered American forces are going to be confronted with large masses of Mexican troops moving forward. The big effort being to kind of push these Americans back this way to open up the ability to move back here, because if the Mexicans take Buena Vista and the rest of the American army's here, it's over. That entire American army will be gone. So literally, I think it's fair to say this is very similar. I'd call it an American Thermopylae. All right? So like the Spartans at the Hot Gates, the 300 Spartans, they can't go anywhere. They can't retreat. This is the only place they can fight. They either have to stand or they have to, or they'll be annihilated. And I would say this, for volunteer troops that are not as well trained as regular U.S. Army troops, that motivation of knowing your back's to the wall probably played a big role in the outcome of the battle in and of itself. The primary key, though, is if it's the courage of the American infantry, that is those militia troops, those National Guard troops that composed most of Zachary Taylor's army. The primary key, though, are a few batteries of regular United States artillery called flying artillery. They were composed primarily of 6-pound guns, and they were trained, honed to a high pitch of efficiency. And we had innovated in our artillery branch in the early 1840s, making our artillery pieces lighter. The gun crews are highly trained and can fire, relatively speaking, about 6 times to every 1 shot that a Mexican artillery piece can fire. And this is even more significant. Because they're light, they can move around the battlefield. And those guns will move to every hot spot on the battlefield, wherever it looks like those volunteer troops are getting ready to break. And what they do is fire right into the face of the Mexicans, oftentimes breaking their will. Now remember, they haven't eaten for 2 days as well, okay? This battle hangs at many points on a razor's edge. And the most famous part of the battle, and I'll just call your attention to it, is eventually, by the evening of the 23rd, the Mexican troops, there are troops back here moving down one spine to get on the road. There's still American troops defending up forward here. There's Mexican cavalry that are moving back in this direction as well. Zachary Taylor will be moving back and forth between Saltillo and this battlefield. He has with him one experienced regiment of volunteers commanded by his former son-in-law, a guy named Jefferson Davis. And he will commit what in essence is his final reserve along one of the spines back here. There are elements of another volunteer unit that had broken, the 3rd Indiana, and they will set up at one of the narrow spots on one of the spines that goes back in this direction away from the mountains that are here. And they will be confronted by over 1,000 Mexican cavalry. So roughly speaking, we're talking about 300 dudes and about 1,500 Mexican cavalry moving towards them. And what you're normally supposed to do in that, if you're infantry, is form into what's called a square. Well, Davis doesn't do that. He sets up essentially in a concave shape. He makes what's called a V. The Mexicans move forward. They fire several measured volleys right into the face of them, and the Mexican cavalry turns away and goes away. And it's in essence late on the afternoon of the 23rd that final turning back of the Mexican cavalry right here is the part that means that at the end of that day, well, that day's fighting is over. All right? So, it's the 23rd, the evening of the 23rd. And Santa Anna has a question that he has to answer. And one of them is, all right, we fought 2 days. My troops haven't eaten, but, this is a use or lose situation. I can either turn back and fight another day, or I can say, we've had enough, and retreat. Well, he calls a council of war and meets with his generals. He's already decided in his mind largely that he's going to return to San Luis Potosí. His generals confirm that decision. So the Americans know that they have come this close to losing everything. And they expect the next day, on the 24th, that the Mexicans will return. And they don't. Instead, they turn around and march back towards San Luis Potosí. The end result will be that when that Mexican army gets back to San Luis Potosí, there will only be about 10,000 or less of them left out of the 20,000 that departed roughly a month before. Okay? These are modern images of the battlefield. What I can tell you is definitively this is Zachary Taylor famously telling Captain Bragg, in charge of one of the artillery pieces, give him more grape. He probably, this was cleaned up for public consumption. Another image. I can tell you that this is as dressed up in the images they showed to the Americans back home as Zachary Taylor ever was. He essentially wore dirty white pants, a blue jacket, and a big straw hat. Right? He never wore this uniform. He wore it once that I'm aware of, his dress uniform in the Mexican War. In any case, this becomes heroic back home. Americans, mainly volunteers, stand against 3-to-1 odds. It's another image of the battlefield, gives a good depiction of, like, in essence, one of these spines coming forward and American troops lined up on one side of a ravine fighting. And then if the Mexicans moving around the end here, which will cause them to retreat, and then essentially you defended along the spine of the hill. Here's another image. That's a modern image, more modern image of the fighting. Very dramatic battlefield. All right, briefly, so we can get to question time. The assessment and the legacy. About 4,700 U.S. troops, primarily volunteers, are engaged, about 650 casualties. Mexico had about 15,000 engaged, although their soldiers were valiant. There was probably a bit of a lack of leadership and willingness to kind of push things home, leadership from the front. About 3,500 casualties. The vast majority of those casualties are due to the effectiveness of American artillery fire. There's a small number of regulars that were in that army. Less than 10,000, as I said, will make it back to San Luis Potosí of the 20,000 that departed. And maybe this is one of the big takes, and this doesn't really sit with the American people. There's vast celebration back in America over this victory. There's like this pent-up anxiety. The newspapers report that this huge army is moving north. And then word comes of this near miraculous victory, right, with volunteer troops, which seems to affirm that one American is worth, 15,000 Mexicans, right? We don't need regulars. Just one Joe off the street with a gun, a little bit of training can do this. To the extent that when Zachary Taylor will return, 1848, they had a big celebration in New Orleans, and I found an example of one guy who offered to burn his house down in celebration of his return. I don't think he did it, but I did find that the offer was made. It must have been during Mardi Gras. What do we get from this war? Well, eventually, the settlement will be essentially what we'd offered before. We'll end up getting California. Now, on the ground, we already had it. But what we want is that treaty because we're Americans. We're not Europeans who just take things. Okay? So we end up, we fight towards Mexico City, which I'm not going to talk about here, but we end up negotiating a treaty that ends the conflict. Another interesting piece of this. 173 future Civil War generals, at least that number that I've counted, served in Zachary Taylor's army, not just at Buena Vista. At Buena Vista, this is just a short list of the folks who served there that if you're a Civil War scholar or you're interested in the Civil War, you'll recognize those. A lot of big names there, okay? A lot of big names there. And I'll say this about Taylor's generalship before I wrap up here, all right? In the literature, if you read about this, John S.D. Eisenhower who wrote a book, a popular history of the Mexican War. He's kind of more kind to Taylor's leadership. If you read West Point military texts about this, Taylor's, the anti-professional who wins because of luck. And in order to make Winfield Scott should be the one you all praise. And in fact, the American people will vote in 1848 on who is the best general. Now, I wouldn't always say a political election is the best way to select your generals. Nevertheless, Taylor, I would say, is a product of the same system. And largely, that's kind of removed from us the ability to look at his performance in northern Mexico. I mean, he's 4-0. Yes, maybe he should not, maybe you shouldn't welcome a battle with an ill-trained force against a force 3 times as large. That's fair enough to say you're assuming a lot of risk. Nevertheless, his rationale for fighting in northern Mexico kind of makes sense as well. So I tell you, when you go back, if you're interested in reading more about this battle, beware of the subtle thing that will say things like John Wool's the real reason they won, or it was because of the regulars, right? There were 4,200 other Americans there besides regular Army troops that fought on the field. And they fought for Zachary Taylor, in part because of his inspirational leadership. He is imperturbable, much like Ulysses S. Grant after the first day at the Battle of Shiloh, who's sitting underneath the tree, smoking a cigar, right? Sherman rides up and says, heck of a day. Yep, beat him tomorrow, though. There's an element of that. John Wool, and although there are no official records of this, the story's been retold enough, will say at the beginning, midway in the battle, on the second day at Buena Vista, the regular John Wool will come up and say, hey, I think we should retreat. Taylor says, we're not going anywhere, we're fighting here. Because he knew that once you set those volunteers in retreat, then you're setting yourself up for something bad, which is a rout. So think about that when you read about the fight and judge for yourself. All right? We learned some of the wrong lessons, I think, from this war. One of the things, this is Mississippi Rifles, 1st Mississippi Rifles under Jefferson Davis. They're the only American infantry unit armed with rifles at the battle. The only problem with rifles is you can't put a bayonet on them. So one reason why Jefferson Davis has them lined up in a line is because if cavalry got close, they were going down anyway. They couldn't put bayonets on the end of their weapons, so that might be one reason why you shoot at them. I will say this. I think we learn the American people learn a few lessons, and they're the wrong lessons from the Mexican War. One is, war works. We won every battle in that war. What did we get? We got a settlement with Mexico. At least that's the way it looked. And there's a lot more going on, which I won't go into now. And here's the second thing, and this is interesting, is it's easy. You don't need regulars to fight a war. Any red-blooded American man with a little bit of training can do this and win on the battlefield. And I'd say that's kind of a baneful effect. It will cause Southerners who will look at units like the 1st Mississippi Rifles and think, well, one Southerner can beat 10 Yankees, right? And it will cause some of those Northern units to believe much the same. In other words, we're left with kind of this legacy that says war is a good way to solve problems. It's short, and you get what you want. And by the way, we don't need a big standing army to do it. Not very good lessons to take home out of this conflict. And I think it accounts for some reason why we run into a conflict that will cost us 628,000 lives in 1861. A guy named Frank Vanderveer said, here's another interesting legacy of the fight. He says that the Confederacy died of the V because it made this dude, Jefferson Davis, who becomes one of the heroes, the shining lights of the conflict. He will be a senator after this. He will also be Secretary of War. And who better to pick as your first president of the Confederacy than somebody who's had political experience and is a military hero? Moving into it. And Davis also he was loyal to a fault to his friends with this dude, Braxton Bragg. Okay? And Braxton Bragg is one of the artillery commanders there, and Davis and Bragg form a friendship, which will lead, for those of you who know, to a rather interesting and troubled relationship between Confederate High Command in the West and perhaps there could have been a generalship change at an earlier point. Arguably, you can say that the American victory there led to the fall, or at least in the West, of the Confederacy. Last few things, help make a president. All right, Zachary Taylor, that's probably dressed more often, how he appeared on the battlefield. He wore civilian clothes. He's clearly, along with George Washington, and Andrew Jackson, one of our military presidents. And largely America got what they expected when they made him president. All right? When you elect a general, you expect someone to be decisive. He said he'd be a man above party despite being a Whig. And he looked at the Southerners and he said, guess what? That territory out west is going to be free. He's a slaveholder. They went, what? And he went, and he basically told the South before he died, right, in 1850 in office. He says, guess what? Try me. So you elected a general. Once he decided what he thought was right, he did it even despite the fact that he has a large plantation in Louisiana and holds slaves himself. In any case, and oftentimes he's looked at as being one of our least successful presidents as a result. And so those things that make you successful as a general don't necessarily mean you're going to be a good political leader. He didn't negotiate. Okay? A couple other maybe interesting things. Mexico City, our oldest national cemetery on foreign soil, is in Mexico City. Almost nobody knows about it. It's not on any maps. Okay? Who are buried there are not dead from the campaign at Buena Vista. But, you know, the word in 2007 was about 2,500 people went and visited it. It's a little tiny thing. It's a mass grave from the fight around Mexico City itself. And what I would say is this. We may have forgotten largely this fight with Mexico. The Mexicans haven't forgotten. This is not from Buena Vista, but Mexico cannot forget and does not forget the fact that we essentially gained about a third of their national territory, despite the fact that only about 30,000 folks live in the Californias. We got it. Most Americans, we don't think about it. For them, it has provided a troubled legacy. This is Chapultepec Castle. That's the home of the Mexican Military Academy. If you go into some restaurants around Kansas City, sometimes the tables have decorations, and sometimes you'll see pictures like this, and you may not know what they are. They're from Los Niños. When this was being taken by the Americans in 1847, some young cadets, rather than surrender, jumped out of windows and killed themselves, and they're remembered in Mexico City. And they're some of the national heroes of Mexico. And largely, we don't have those folks from this conflict for ourselves. And the last thing I'll say is this. Later, Winfield Scott will march in to the National Plaza in Mexico City in 1847. There's a painting of it. Here's that same National Plaza today. And the biggest, every day, the Mexican regular forces, or Army troops, will move out and hang the biggest flag, Mexican flag, I think, in existence from that central plaza. You know, as Americans, we don't really remember, you know, we kind of halfway remember that the British burned the White House, but we don't really get upset about that, do we? You know, the Mexicans remember. There was a time when the American flag was flying over their national plaza. And so I leave you with these words. To some extent, you know, our victory there, even though to us it's largely forgotten, the legacy of the war with Mexico, maybe it's best summed up by President Porfirio Diaz, who said famously, "Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." Well, anyway, I've raced through it. Maybe there's a little overview. We can talk a lot more about the battle tactics and other things, but I'd probably stop at this point. Thank you for listening. Ready? Any questions?
Had any of the U.S. regiments trained together at battalion or full regimental strength before they joined Taylor's army?
The volunteer units? I was thinking regular. Oh, okay. Actually, generally, no. The American Army, prior to the war with Mexico, largely was a frontier constabulary force, and they also did things like build internal improvements and coastal fortifications. So most of them are in the West. They get together, and the key event, there is a brief gathering at Fort Jessup, and there is an army of so-called, in Louisiana, of observation before the annexation of Texas takes place. And then they're ordered across when it looks as if that's a fait accompli. And they're moved down, and that's actually part of the negotiations with the Texans, which is, look, if you're going to annex us, you better have our back, because at this point, our defense problem is no longer just ours, it's yours as well. But it's at Corpus Christi that American Army, about 4,000 regulars, gets together and begins to maneuver at the brigade and battalion level. Now, they're individually proficient, okay? The companies are. But frankly, you know, there is absolutely, other than Winfield Scott, no major, I mean, nobody's commanded in the field anything bigger than, you know, a battalion. Okay? And Scott did it many years before during the War of 1812. So that is a seminal event. And even then, there is, what will show up is the difference that West Point and places like Norwich, another military academy, make. Junior level leadership is one of the things we take out, in its significance, is one of the things we take out of the War of 1812. And it is the fact that those junior level leaders, who even then are saying, follow me when things break down, and they know their business, at least in terms of close order drill, will make all of the difference in the world. All right? A lot of the folks that are regulars, like regular soldiers, I mean, you can look at some of the roles there, and many of them are new immigrants, some of whom will desert and famously form the San Patricio artillery unit. They're Irishmen in there, and they'll leave. And I would come back to the point, and Scott says this, right, that it is really West Point, although I would also add, and again, come back, Norwich. It's those professional junior level leaders that make all of the difference, and they make this stuff happen on the ground because they're willing to lead as opposed to, stand behind and just give orders. Famously, Ulysses S. Grant is one of those. I mean, there are a ton of other ones we could talk about. I'll share one brief anecdote about Grant at Corpus Christi. Grant, he had a party of soldiers who were supposed to prepare an area for boats to come ashore with supplies, okay, in the shallows off Corpus on the beach. And Grant got out with his troops and took his shirt off and got in the water with them. At that point, there are other West Pointers who come up in his regiment, 4th Infantry, and they're looking at him and they're making fun of him. And it's at that point, and this brings me back to Zachary Taylor as a charismatic leader, who rides up. This is the general, who's wearing, by the way, nothing that makes him look like a general, and looks at him and he goes, this army needs more people like Lieutenant Grant. And then he rides off. And you can imagine the effect that might have had, on it. In other words, that divide between officers and men, kind of went aside. Did that answered your question and more? In Louisiana, we call a little something for nothing or a little something extra lagniappe. So that was a little lagniappe.
I noticed your list there didn't include the name of Ulysses S. Grant.
Yes.
And did his experience in the Mexican War influence his generalship in the Civil War any?
That is a fantastic question. I will tell you why he's not on the list. Grant is a regular in a regular infantry regiment. So he will be there at Palo Alto. He will be there at Resaca de la Palma. He will be there at Monterrey, although he is with those forces that are redeployed to join Scott for the landing at Veracruz. So he's not going to be in northern Mexico. And famously, he'll fight in every battle moving from Veracruz inland, and most famously, perhaps, at near Mexico City itself. The question of how much influence this event had is a thorny one. I've seen it dealt with more sensitively and less sensitively. The worst thing is, this happened there, they learned this. It's a bit more complex. What I will say is Grant was a junior level leader at the very junior level. He will serve as a quartermaster who will find every opportunity he has to go out and get shot at. So he doesn't stay behind being a supply guy. He's a supply guy who will go out. At Monterrey, famously, he rides a horse in front of a company of guys simply because he's authorized to have a horse when all the other infantry guys are on foot. All right? So he's looking to get into trouble. He seizes the initiative again at Mexico City. What did he learn from that? Well, he writes in his memoirs that he learned a lot from both Winfield Scott and he learned a lot from Zachary Taylor. And he learned different things. Scott was brilliant, and he was a good planner. Taylor, I think he learned something more about how to lead American soldiers, right? And Taylor was famously imperturbable. And Scott, frankly, Scott's not imperturbable. He's probably more like me. If you make him mad, he acts mad rather than gets calm, right? In that sense. And observing those folks had an effect. Observing Taylor at Palo Alto with his leg wearing a pair of dirty white pantaloons and a jacket with a hole on it, sitting there behind his troops, just kind of watching the battle. That imperturbability. And he remembered how that made him feel. Because the boss isn't upset, right? well, guess what? I've got to emulate the boss. And I would say those are the kinds of things he took away. Maneuver, not so much. And I'm always suspicious about, like, I think about what I think I learned at 20. I'm not real sure those are lessons to be successful at 50, which I'm fast approaching. You know what I mean? I will say that I was a very smart 20-year-old today. I'm not quite sure I was back then. Okay? So, anyway. Other questions?
Were the American forces already in place above Santa Anna's forces when this started?
Yes. That's a great question, and thank you for asking. Well, I've gotten out of it. Here's what happened. Okay, Zachary Taylor had an intelligence network that went out and let him know Santa Anna was coming. What's interesting, and there's an interesting side story to this. Ben McCullough's Texas Rangers had, and the so-called Mexican Spy Company, they called it, I would say they were guys who didn't paint between the line. And if you're a regular Army officer, Taylor was tolerant of most folks, but these guys had a reputation for abusing Mexicans, and largely they went out and lived off the land. What I will tell you is they also knew everything that was going on within a 50-mile radius of Taylor's army. They're sent home. Taylor will recall them into northern Mexico because the supply columns are getting hit more often. Ben McCullough's folks are out in front. So what surprises Taylor is once he discovers that they're coming, there's a town called Agua Nueva, which is the first place you can stop and get water when you come out of the desert before you get to Saltillo. Clearly a place you'd like to hold, but it's wide open ground. Brilliant place for 3-to-1 odds against a small force. And they're warned that they're coming. Taylor gives the orders to take all the supplies there, because this was where the supplies for the forward outpost line were, to get them out. They'll end up having to burn some of their supplies. So they're moving at a faster pace than they might like and leave behind 5 wagons. What's interesting about this, and then redeploy to this place that Wool had already reconnoitered. Now he asked Taylor for permission. Taylor's like, no, this is a good place. Yeah, go ahead and set the troops up. General Wool is actually the one responsible largely for the setup, the initial American setup. So the vast majority of American troops are in place when Santa Anna attacks. So they attack us on ground of our own choosing, or at least the only, I would argue this. You know, if you're going to fight there, that's probably the only place you can fight. If you fall back to Saltillo, it's in the middle of a wide open area as well. This is kind of it, right, in that narrow pass, and they're there ahead of time. They have an opportunity to dig in some areas narrow entrenchments, shallow entrenchments, and put up breastworks on the tops of some of those ridges. Now, literally, I haven't been there. I've seen photographs, though. Some of those are sheer kind of ravines that are 30 feet, and the angle's like this, right? So it's not going to take a whole lot of folks at the top of that to discourage you from trying to climb up the sides of it. So they're largely in position. Now Santa Anna will ride up and see those burning wagons, and he'll think that the Americans are doing what he thinks, what he would do, run away. And he tells his troops to push on without stopping to get water, without stopping to wait for a wagon to come up to give them something to eat. So they will fight on the 22nd with almost no food. They will fight on the 23rd with almost no food. He will not allow them on the night of the 23rd to light fires. This is February in Mexico. It rains. It's cold. So in some ways, the fact that there was a bit of a skedaddle, at least from the forward elements, they're not going to catch any big units because most of the troops are already back there, actually got in Santa Anna's head to encourage him to move faster than perhaps he should have. He could have stopped and let folks fill up their canteens, but by all words, those Mexican troops continued to push forward. And he told them things like, hey, we'll be eating American food tonight if you just keep going. We've got them on the run, boys. Let's go.
He could not, Santa Anna could not have continued up the road past them?
No. Here's Agua Nueva sits on the main road. And then the main road to Saltillo goes between two mountains. There's a place called the Narrows, La Angostura. That's what the Mexicans call the battle. The hacienda of Buena Vista sits at the top of the pass, and then once you come over that pass, it opens up into the valley that has Saltillo in it. So what he's doing is he's taking his main force, his infantry and everything. There was another pass. He will send 1,500 cavalry under a general named Mignon through this pass to threaten Saltillo, Taylor's supply base. And Taylor will march back and forth with an escort on these 2 days with the 1st Mississippi, May's dragoons, regular army, a small force of dragoons, and a couple of artillery pieces back and forth, because he doesn't want that to be taken. But they're entrenched there. There's a force of about, I'd say about 250 folks with 2 heavy cannons sitting back in Saltillo. So he's aware of Mignon. Later on, Mignon will be prosecuted for failure to act and failure to be aggressive in moving on Saltillo. But he commits his main force along what we would call, what's going to be his main supply line, his main supply route, his MSR. Okay? You need to clear the main road. So that's where the Americans are stationed. One more question. I'm getting...
Well, I'll close with one that might seem to be humorous, but since you mentioned, to bizarre at least, since you did make brief reference to the San Patricio group, the
Yes.
Irish immigrants, I've read about these mostly from Mexican sources, and it may refer to the other battle, the Churubusco, the one that happened
Yes.
in the South, that they consider a great Pyrrhic defeat, bravery on all sides. Whose side were the San Patricios on?
Well, that's a good question. And I think I know what you're asking. I'll throw this back. The San Patricios are there at Buena Vista. They're manning heavy guns there. There's some elements of them there. These are Irish soldiers. I'd prefer to call them that. They're Irish American in the fact that they had come through the United States. And, we don't know enough about the tension between religion and to what extent the Irish soldiers in the U.S. Army that deserted and joined the Mexicans were doing it in part because, frankly, to be a U.S. Army soldier, they weren't considered like today heroes. Regular soldiers weren't. Officers were. Conditions were not good. The Mexicans were happy to welcome them there. I throw out to you, I don't think they're fighting for Mexico. I think they're probably mainly fighting for themselves, and the Mexicans are there, and that was one of the conditions for switching sides. That's more or less my take. That being said, there's a whole little like narrow school. There are 2 things in the Mexican War that I tend to hate to be asked about. One is the San Patricios, because there's a whole bunch of stuff written in a narrow lane on that. And the other is the Mormon battalion. And so we've got this war nobody really studies that much about, and yet we have this lane of articles and things that are written on 2 units that have a particular religious and ethnic appeal. So a long answer to your short question is, I think the San Patricios are largely fighting for themselves. And if Mexico comes out victorious in this war, they're going to get land after it's over, and they're probably going to be set up well for it. That's my take, based on what I've read. All right. Well, thank you all for coming.